Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the invite. And looking at this type of classroom reminds me of the days when I was at college and where I made up for my sleep time. And I hope to keep you at least interested in a subject that, although at times seems far away, is a lot closer than you think. For there isn't a conflict in the world going on today that will not affect us here. And here I'm speaking even of North America, which includes Canada also, as we are countries that have capabilities of deploying, capabilities of intervening, capabilities of preventing, and as such are not necessarily isolationists. And because of that, it also makes us targets in this complex and ambiguous era in which we have stumbled into since the end of the Cold War. And that's the initial sort of feel of the exercise, is to remind you that where we are now in this period is not in any way, shape, or form similar to where we were during the Cold War, which ended in 1989. We were at that time in a very classic sort of era. It goes all the way back to the Westphalia and to in Munster, where they signed that treaty that established the nation states and the whole construct of that and nationalism. So that's over 3 centuries ago, and it ended in a sort of way in which diplomacy would be working and doing its thing, and if it failed, then it would turn to its militaries, who would then fight in a classic use of force, which is essentially attrition warfare. And then at the end of that, whoever is left standing would either create a reconciliation process or nation building or expand its own capabilities. A very sequential sort of sequence of events in the classic sense of the different disciplines that are part of a nation state, or nation states, or alliances of nation states. However, at the end of the Cold War, all that went for a significant loop, because what we stumbled into was an era of not nation states going after other nation states, but a whole era of imploding nations, of failing states, of crisis management, of, in fact, civil wars, in which we saw extremes, abuses of human rights to the extent of mass atrocities and even genocide. And so in this sort of era in which we have not at all been prepared for, we are still very much ad hocing our way through it. We're still on-job training. We're still learning lessons. We are still crisis managing. And so the Iraq and the Afghanistan and the Syria, the Lebanon, Liberia, and a number of conflicts in countries everywhere from South Sudan right to Myanmar, and even some of the drug wars as like Colombia, we are still trying to figure out how to make all that stuff work. And in fact, the reason why we're still stumbling is that all these things are happening concurrently. These different disciplines are now bouncing off each other concurrently. You have the security problem in the nation that you're trying to resolve and stabilize to create an atmosphere of security. You've got the development people who are there trying to reconstitute an infrastructure. You've got humanitarians who are taking care of massive humanitarian problems, be they huge refugee camps, internally displaced camps, and the like. You've got nation builders who are there engaged in trying to bring back a system of governance, a system of judicial process, trying to rebuild the police forces. All those things are happening concurrently, as we've seen in Afghanistan and other places. And through that, you hope there's a thread of humanity that is also trying to bring reconciliation and the prevention of these conflicts from exploding again. And so your greatest, in fact, weapon against another conflict happening and going into crisis is, in fact, how much you invest in the reconciliation process post the conflict. In this sort of complex and ambiguous era, with so many different disciplines playing at the same time, and with no fundamental concept or conceptual framework is the word I've been using, to where all this can work together, to be more synergistic, to be much more coordinated, much more in collaboration, much more in coordination. In fact, because we haven't reached much of that, certainly at our higher levels back in our nation states, as we're trying to help them there, and we do get some of that coordination, cooperation between humanitarians, the police, the military, and so on in the field, mostly because it's personality driven, we are seeking to invent something new. What can bring all this stuff together so that it reinforces each other versus operating in its stovepipe of each discipline with maybe a goodwill to try to make it work a bit together. And so the stovepipes or the layers that are piled one on top of the other are making scenarios more complex, far more expensive, creating frictions that may not even have been there in the first place, sustaining conflicts that are even generational, like the use of child soldiers that are still continuing to be used in the conflicts by non-state actors or by spoilers. And because of all that, we are essentially still trying to figure out how not only to do conflict resolution, where we often end up late in the exercise. Just look at Syria and even Libya, where we finally get in late. The Congo finally get in late. But how will we really achieve the ultimate aim of preventing these frictions from actually becoming conflicts? And one of the underlying problematics of our time is that the players that are in the field engaged in these frictions caused by ethnicity, by tribalism, by religion, by power sharing, by total disregard of any reference to human rights, to conventions of any sort. In such a scenario, it is now completely foreign to us to find other means of staying ahead of the game, wresting the initiative from these people, and in fact resolving. And so we are dragged in or moved into these programs, into these conflicts, often with not the right skill sets, not the right mixture of capabilities, and with our perception of what the solution should be, instead of a far more intellectually rigorous and far more aware capability of what's happening. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why we are in a state right now of attempting to simply save what we can, of finding ourselves more often sending a whole bunch of money to be able to sustain people versus trying to resolve problems. Look at Darfur, where we're just throwing a whole whack of humanitarian assistance, but there's no effort whatsoever in trying to resolve that conflict. And because we're doing that, and because we're not going to the root causes of many of these conflicts, these frictions that end up in conflicts, we are going to see for some time to come these complex and ambiguous scenarios that call on very difficult mandates, and in the field near impossible dilemmas of ethical, moral, and legal nature to actually apply those mandates to bring resolution. That's the nature of the beast now, because we just have not invented, created the tools of this era. The tools of the previous era of humanitarian space, of neutrality, of the NGOs not wanting to work with the military or with the police, of the diplomats often functioning in an isolation of the nature of the security. That era of the past functioned when you had nation states against nation states, and you were coming to peace agreements that were bringing solutions that seemed to be reasonable on both sides. Or at least someone overcame and was then trying to establish peace. But they don't function now. And so I, as a force commander, go in front of the International Criminal Court, which is one of the few tools of our era that we've brought to the fore to try to fight impunity. If I am the force commander and I am brought in front of the International Criminal Court in order to testify against the perpetrators of these abuses of human rights, these crimes against humanity, be they the use of rape as an instrument of war, use of child soldiers, the total disregard to any of the precepts of human rights, including torture and so on. If I'm called to testify in front of there, why would other neutral agencies refuse to testify, even though they're heavily engaged? And the favorite target of mine is the International Red Cross. It is the sort of ayatollah of the neutrality in the concept of the world. I don't say that pejoratively, I just say that because they're the most determined to remain in that context. And there is certainly a viable reason. The question, however, is that reason of neutrality still as functional and as essential? Because in Rwanda, there were only two bodies left that could do any sort of activity whatsoever. The force I was commanding and the International Red Cross small contingent of doctors reinforced by Médecins Sans Frontières and their hospital. They saw at least as much, and from a different angle in a number of circumstances, the abuses of human rights and who perpetrated them and the impact of that. Yet they refused categorically to testify in the International Criminal Court. International Criminal Court, which is a whole new body brought in by the Rome Statute in the year 2000, 2001, that essentially is fighting impunity in the world. And by refusing to testify, number of those who did perpetrate the genocide, génocidaires, have gotten off or didn't get what justice should demand, what the Rwandan survivors require as justice for the horrible scenarios in which they lived. So this era is just screaming for far more fundamental thinking, far more fundamental commitment, intellectual commitment to conflict resolution, but really the essence of it is conflict prevention. How do we prevent the frictions of the differences that exist for a variety of reasons I've given already? How do we prevent them from getting to the state of crisis that ultimately call for people to kill each other, to destroy human life? Because we're all equal. All humans are human. There isn't one human more human than the other. There's nobody here who's more human than the neighbor. Every one of us is equal. And in this era in which we can actually very soon, Skype every human being in the planet, you can't divorce yourself from that fact of humanity. You can't divorce yourself from recognizing their humanity, nor can you divorce yourself from the fact of the massive abuses of human rights when you believe in human rights. When you have in your country laws, fundamental laws, charters that articulate human rights, that specify that all are equal, and that it doesn't say it's human rights only for those who can afford lawyers. It says human rights for all of these human beings. And in that construct, we continue to stumble because we still are so short-sighted and so seemingly caught off guard by the nature of the conflicts that are evolving, that in fact millions are suffering. Tens of millions are suffering, and millions are actually dying. That we use as instruments of war, we introduce as instruments of war, a fundamental instrument of war, children, to be the preferred weapon in these low-intensity conflicts. The preferred weapon, the weapon of choice in sustaining these conflicts. I'm in a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, 3 kilometers from the border. And over the social media, there are calls for 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds inside the camp to come and join the Free Syrian Army, to fight. And the question is what's the value of that 13-year-old? Why engage a 13-year-old? To what avail? Why make a generational war sustain itself on the back of children? The fact that the children, the youth of many of those nations reflect well over 50% of the population, and their availability being what it is either by duress or freely, makes it easier, of course, to go and recruit them and use them. An easier argument than trying to get adults to engage in such complex and such ruthless scenarios. Yet we let that happen. We do have, yes, the International Criminal Court. We do recognize it's a crime against humanity. We do hold people accountable when we catch them. We do in the UN have programs to shame nations who recruit in their own forces, let alone non-state actors. Yet over the last 20 years that these weapons have been massively used, and a great study was done in 1996 for the UN by Gracia Michel, the widow of Nelson Mandela, in which they estimated close to 200,000 children are at any one time recruited in order to be involved in conflicts, not just up front with an AK-47, but doing everything from building the bivouacs to carrying water to being sex slaves and bushwives of adults. That's all part of being a child soldier. Yet for the last 20 years, we have not seen a reduction of the use of that weapon. On the contrary, we've seen it grown in nature, not necessarily numbers. We haven't seen a reduction in numbers, but we've seen a change in nature of this beast, this weapon, rendering it even more ruthless with the Al-Shabaab, with the Boko Haram, the ISIS, and how they've been able to exploit this weapon. Yet, in all that, we will get the reaction from the international community that we've been spending billions on child soldiers. And those billions, yes, have been spent on what? On rehabilitation and reintegration of those that survive, those that we can get out. There is nothing done for the hundreds upon hundreds of thousands who never make it, don't survive to make it to a rehabilitation camp. who are left to die of disease, of injury, of malnutrition and abuse while they're being used 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. How many are still in that number? And what about those that are recruited in the front end, that are being used? How are we reducing their effectiveness? And so far we have seen essentially treating child soldiers just like any other combatant, any other soldier on the field. And in so doing, we rapidly will either go to use of kinetic force, blow them away, just like we'll do with any combatant we face, irrelevant of the fact that 40% of the child soldiers are girls thrown into many of these conflicts. So we either simply kill children, or we pull back, we withdraw, we give space, which then reinforces the use of children because the non-state actor is winning, is gaining. And the more that we keep pulling back and trying to avoid engaging, the more that weapon becomes effective, the more it gets recruited and sustained. And so the aim is to try to reduce the number that get recruited. And once they're recruited, to reduce their effectiveness so that they are not worth being recruited and become a liability to those who want to use them. There's been no investment in that preventive side of things. There have been billions spent. Save the Children, War Child, World Vision, UNICEF. Billions spent on picking up the pieces of those that have survived. And that's not negative, but that's not proactive. And by the by, those programs have not all been so successful in a variety of reasons. When I was in Sierra Leone, at the ebbing part of that war, the NGOs were using 3-month programs to rehabilitate, reintegrate the children back into society. And so one of the things they were teaching the boys is how to be cobblers in a country where people didn't wear shoes. Teaching girls how to make soap only and keeping them at the most basic levels. Doing nothing to prepare the community for the return of these children, where the community will have maybe a reticence of seeing them back because of what they've done in the community, done around, and the fear of what they might turn into. And what about the re-recruitment? An ex-child soldier can be re-recruited through the use of child abduction and child slavery and illegal movement of children, and be used in another conflict. I have seen children in Côte d'Ivoire that were from Sierra Leone, recruited, sold, and used as soldiers in another conflict. So that's one component of the complexities of what we are facing in this era. And although we're writing a lot of rules, and we're putting some laws in, and we even got a court set up to fight that impunity, and although there is an engagement, there's over 110,000 peacekeepers out there. There are engagements that are based on alliances, like NATO going into Afghanistan and the like. Even though there are a variety of engagements, there is out there no tools now effective enough to not only mitigate significantly these conflicts. At best, we're stabilizing some, waiting for another outbreak, because our reconciliation processes are so inept and not well integrated, or we're watching them carry on. And we're just throwing cash at it. And we hope that that will suffice, and that with the NGO community, which is so heavily engaged, that it will carry the day. When General Petraeus was commanding the forces in Afghanistan and I was chairing the Defense Committee in the Canadian Senate, we had him as a witness and asked him, he said, "What are you doing, General, with the NGO community in Afghanistan? They're all over the place." There were over 7,000 NGO organizations, not people, organizations in Afghanistan, a mom and pop outfit to the big players, all over the place. Imagine the information they had, imagine the insights they have, the ability to understand the culture, to understand the languages, to understand the traditions, to be able to influence the policies, influence the mandates, influence the concepts of operations that would make them more effective to establish atmospheres of security. And he said, "I'm doing nothing with them." I said, "Why is that?" He says, "They don't want to talk to me. They don't want to cross that humanitarian space. They don't want to cross that neutrality argument." Yet all that is there, operating independently, not solving problems, but trying to sustain a level of emergency capability versus trying to actually bring forth new capability. And so I said, "Well, what are you doing then in the development side of the house? Because you're obviously in a country that needs its new infrastructure, it's got to come forward with the new capabilities, you know, schools and whatever." And he said, "Well, we are discussing where we feel the areas are secure enough." But he said there is no discussion on the details of where these capabilities are deployed. There's no sort of integrated concept of operations between what we want to secure and how to secure it and what we're building up behind it. And so you end up with schools in areas that are not necessarily secure. They get built and they get used by the extremists. You get areas where they need schools and there's no way of convincing people that it should go there because of a contractual arrangement that's been made with the local warlord to do it in another place, and on and on and on. And so some aspects of this are coming, however, to light, to solve, to give us a feel for maybe we might be able to move forward. The most dominant new dimension in conflict, prevention, let alone resolution, is the empowerment of women. It is an element that has barely really touched the full scale that it can to influence the policies, influence the solutions, influence on the ground, and actually engage in sustaining and building capacity long-term in many of these countries. The women are held so far back, yet they can provide such a significant influence. And the men so hung up with all the traditional dimensions and so on that they keep building on, in often a very misogynist framework, is preventing the nation from actually getting the full power of its brains, but also of the nature of its people to be able to change, to advance. When I go in and argue and advocate against use of children as weapons of war, I'm in South Sudan. They tell me, oh, they said 13-year-old boys, of course they got a rifle because they're defending our cattle against other tribes and so on. And so they're considered to be an adult. A little girl who's 12, because of the cultural framework and so on, is allowed to be married and recognized as married by the community and is pregnant. And so she is an adult. So it's not unusual to use 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds to do the fighting, to be in the forefront of the conflict, to sustain the conflict, to actually keep the conflict going, because there's so many of them and you can generate so long. and keep the conflict going multi-generational, because kids don't just stay kids. After 4 or 5 years, as teenagers, they become adults, and so that's all they know. And they got no education and so on. So the only thing they know is keep the fight going. So you keep generational fights going for decades if you do that. Ladies and gentlemen, a 12-year-old girl who's pregnant is not an adult. She's a 12-year-old girl that's pregnant. A 13-year-old who is armed to the teeth, ready to kill, and trained to do that, is not an adult. It's a 13-year-old boy who's been trained to kill. The brain of the child is not shaped to be able to comprehend the nature of these. That's me. Where the hell is it? It's my wife. Should I answer? No. The brain is still shaping. That's why the age 18 is so significant, because by human beings, the animal that we are, the species that we are, that brain starts to be far more cognitive, to be able to comprehend the risks of pushing the envelope, of being able to move into an area of judgment. And many people want to push it to 21. So you can't tell me that a 13-year-old is an adult when the dimensions of adulthood are not even close to being shaped inside the body of that human being. And so when I get that human rights are a Western invention, I humbly tell you, as a soldier, I'm now very vulgar, although at times may be, that is bullshit. Because it is not an invention of the Western world. It is a reality of the creation of the human being and the conceptual knowledge of what human beings are, what they can do, how they can do it at different times as they evolve in ages, and in so doing recognizes limitations. And so I do not back off from religious, cultural, traditional arguments that are prepared to tell me that a 14-year-old is a soldier. To me, that is simply an ill comprehension of what humanity is, and a lack of ability to adjust either the religious framework, the cultural framework, or the traditional framework to what we have been able to comprehend of humanity and be able to put onto the table. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are barely trying to get at some of the prevention tools. And you can see right there how complex that could be. So certainly empowerment of women and changing the nature of some of those is crucial, and the understanding of rights of women, let alone the engagement of them. The rights of children. Child rights up front is a concept. Thirdly, education. Education. Giving them the objective ability, the intellectual rigor to comprehend the problems they're facing or will face, and the ability to do the analysis and synthesis and produce the solutions to those problems. It is through the rigorous development of the mind. Education. And education equally for men, girls, boys, women. That's the third one. The fourth one is maybe a little more difficult. Is actually built on the premise that we do believe that all humans are human. To actually believe that we are all equal. and that we move away from any of the frameworks and reticence that we have between us, and artificially create scenarios in which we say, oh, well, we are a tolerant society, and try to work the margins of tolerance. Who in the heck do you think you are to tolerate another human being? Who has given you that position, that ability? The only true expression of equality is respect. Respect means equal. Tolerance still has a latent underpinning of difference that can be exploited and, in fact, used against. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're just starting this new era. We've only been about 25 years into this era of imploding nations and failing states and civil wars and massive abuses of human rights and the introduction of bodies that are completely outside of the framework of any of the conventions we've created. And the way we're going right now is we're not about to be out of it. And unless we invent a means by which we can get ahead of the game and introduce new capabilities of actually creating, as I would say in conclusion, a whole different generation of leadership that is multidisciplinary, not single-focused, multidisciplinary. A general who knows only how to fight is useless in this era. A general who understands the problem, who participates with other disciplines in trying to bring innovative solutions, and that only in extremis, when a scenario calls for it, is prepared to use force, credible force, to protect others. That's what we're looking for. And so as a result of some of the reforms in which I was leading in Canada, we've introduced in our military college, imagine the Cold Warriors, who all we knew was how to blow away Russians the minute they stepped across that line for decades. Imagine introducing to those who have that warrior ethic and that belief that the ability to use force, the threat of use of force, is the overriding strength. Imagine telling them that no, your core of your officer corps, the CORE of your CORPS, core of your officer corps needs anthropology, needs sociology, needs philosophy. So they understand and be fully participatory in the solutioning of the problem before using their warrior skills and experience and knowledge in the protection should the situation degenerate. So, ladies and gentlemen, I put that slide up. I've got 145 others. I put that slide up in order to set the strategic framework of your thinking. Do you, in your being, in your heart, in your sense, do you believe that in fact the future of humanity is in a survival mode? Do you actually think that because of a variety of factors, from nuclear weapons to environment to the growing population and demographics and so on, that we are in a survival mode? Do you believe that humanity is out there hoping to survive? And if that's the case, do you still want kids? And I don't say that flippantly, because there's a couple people here who've got gray hair with me, or got a few years in, who remember the 60s. And remember the 60s when we had these huge horns all over the country. And we used to practice if there was a nuclear attack, that we'd hide underneath our desks as if that would help. During those years, the flower power years, the ban the bomb years, we debated whether or not we wanted children. Do you want to bring children into a world that all of a sudden a couple idiots get a hold of some of those weapons and wipe out the whole of humanity, which we can do several times over? You actually want to take that risk? Why would you want to create human beings living under that context? And so, today, are we actually thinking that we're already moved into a survival mode? Or do you have, in your thinking and what you want to achieve, in meeting not only your personal ambitions, but to advance humanity, to advance the plight of humanity? Because remember, this is an era where we can actually nearly Skype the whole of humanity. We're already global. You under 25s are already the generation without borders. I mean, you're global already. My son, who played on war games on the computer with a kid in Moscow and another one in Rio, to him, they were next door. If this generation without borders, with the revolutions of communications and capabilities, what if that generation said, no, we are in the mode of wanting to continue to make humanity thrive. That 80% of have-nots, we can shift it. We will influence it. That the 20% will not leave it behind. That we will actually advance it. And that we will move humanity positively. And we will make a communion, a covenant between humanity and the planet, so that we can thrive. If you don't work from that positive premise, and you're already in an attitude of survival, we'll never find the new solutions. We'll never really get at the innovative ways of how humanity will be able to avoid conflict, will avoid the frictions of our differences degenerating into killing each other. Thank you very much.
And now we'll move to slide 2.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. No, wow, that was beautiful. At this point, I want to open this up. Man, you've given us a lot to think about, ask about, but I want to throw this out to you. My mind, of course, is going 80 miles an hour, but it's not about me. It's about you. So I want to open this up to questions. Lisa?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you present this really beautiful idea of all humans being equal and deserving of the same dignity and respect. I'm just wondering, with the atrocity that you've witnessed, how are you able to maintain that premise when you look at those that recruit child soldiers and commit such acts? How do you still believe in the goodness of a human? To start things off light.
First thing is, I'm an ex-artillery officer, so you got to talk loud. What is my other option? I looked at the other option. And when I faced the other option, I attempted suicide 4 times. Didn't succeed because there was too many people around me. I should have fired my aide-de-camp, and a few other people maybe had more room. What's my other option when I see that? Now that is a sort of a practical response, right? We blew that one. Maybe we can reduce it. Maybe we can attrit these abuses of human rights. Maybe with time and the expansion of that thinking and the growing of that thought, that we'll be able to overcome these massive abuses in these frameworks. And I would argue that I think fundamentally human beings are not Darwinian. I think that human beings individually seek serenity. Serenity for their own. Even the worst asshole wants serenity for his own people. And that means finding solutions that will sustain that serenity and not live under the threat of being abused. And I think it might take just a couple centuries. So what? What's a couple centuries? Look, we've been at it for thousands of years. We haven't sorted it out, but we're moving. and we can now move at a much faster pace. We can actually talk to the whole humanity. We got a generation here, under 25, that soon will be the most active activists we've ever seen. They can coalesce, they can do it in real time, and they can build like it's extraordinary. Just think of yesterday's election. Think of yesterday's election. We had one not long ago. The population under 30, I use 25 to 30, to 18 to that age, it was about 35% of the voting population in my country the last election. Barely 20% of them voted. That means that over 3 million votes in a country like mine, that's a lot of votes, were never used and have never been used. Mine's been used, but theirs has never been used. And they're coming into the system and they're never used. The balance of power in our democracies, this country, yesterday, here, the balance of power is in the hands of those between 18 and 30. You hold the balance of power because your numbers have never been on the screen, in the computer. So when I go to universities like here, and I'm told, well, you know, we can't do much, you know, and we're prepared to let our grandparents decide for us in a world where the future is right in your face. I mean, it's changing at such a rapid pace, and you let us, who've already lived it, we're going to decide for your future that's in your face. I say that's irresponsible. And it's even more irresponsible when you actually have the power to change it. And now, with the revolution of communications, you have that power exponentially increased as a force multiplier. And so what you end up with in democracies is what the youth of those democracies have let happen. Not the old farts. They're engaged to varying degrees. It's the disengagement of the youth into their future, which is staring them in the face. That where I believe the sin exists in not getting the best we can. So if we got politicians who are weak, that are not statesmen, that we got scenarios like you described happen and still happen, I think it's because we have not engaged all our capacity. And I think we can. And I think it's going to take time. And I must tell you that it's taken me years to figure out whether or not spiritually I can also sustain the future. That whether or not it's possible that God permitted that to happen. Or did the devil really take over that country and is winning on the surface of the earth? And that's my short answer. Thank you.
But despair is not an option.
Cynicism has got to be wiped out. The most negative force in any society. I'm scaring everybody?
No, this isn't scary. This is real. Yeah.
So you talk about the survive and thrive aspect of where are we at, and I think for me, we have the potential to thrive to a great amount, but also I think some of the world's most vulnerable populations are still struggling just to survive. And you talked about kind of where the intersection of conflict resolution, preventing conflict and development takes place. So if we want to enable them to give those most vulnerable populations to thrive, how do we do conflict prevention while also enabling them to gain economic status and whatever they need to thrive beyond the subsistence that they're used to?
The essence of my presentation. What's the tool? How do we make that work? How come all these different disciplines that are out there and capabilities don't seem to be able to mesh in order to be reinforcing each other, to create a synergy of solution? Why do we have a development program that doesn't talk to the economic program, that doesn't talk to the security program? Or if it does it from its stovepipe, from great nations like yours and others. The position that I would argue about why that group that 80% is still so far behind the 8 ball in their countries, and how enormous the challenges they have. And don't ask me about corruption and things like that. I mean, the corruption in on the scale in those countries is peanuts compared to the corruption in our countries. I was in front of your Senate Committee on Human Rights and the Law, and discussing whether or not the Americans should engage in Darfur at the time when I was involved. The senator, who was the deputy chair of the committee, started with the first question. The first question he asked me, he said, I don't want to really get involved in a big debate with you, but he said, I don't believe in the UN being the solution. So because at least 25% of all the money that goes to the UN goes into people's Swiss bank accounts around the world. And so he said, why should I want to see that as a solution or an instrument of the solution? And what should we be using? And I said, Senator, are you actually prepared to sit there on this committee or on the Armed Services Committee and tell me that the $1 trillion that you invest in defense, that you're getting $1 trillion worth of defense? That you're not getting ripped off anywhere? $1 trillion. And we go nuts when some, small dictator walks away with $3 million or something. Sure, comparatively it's significant for his country, but it is not a basis for not engaging. And so I would argue that our involvement in trying to advance the plight of humanity is being held back by something we've created in the haves. And what we've created in that 20% of the haves is essentially greed. There's never enough. There's never enough to satiate our needs. And that greed is in fact dominating the decision-making processes, financial decisions, engagement decisions, more than humanitarian decisions, more than even the spilling of blood of our own to defend. In Rwanda, in the first week or so of the genocide, I had world powers, including yours, sending people in to see what's going on and to report back to their country whether or not they were going to support the UN, provide me with assets or troops or so on. And I had every one of them made damn sure that they didn't get out of the country until they came through my office or met me on the tarmac. And I said, what's your recommendation? He said, well, sir, we're recommending that we don't come in. And I said, you've assessed the situation. Yes, of course. We can see it escalating and so on. And it's moving into a scale that's undescribable, that probably will continue and so on. We didn't use the term genocide at that time. It came in about the second week. So I said, well, and that's not worthy of you coming in. They said, no. They said, the problem is there's nothing here. There's no strategic resources. No, there's no oil or coltan or something. And the country's not even in a strategic location. And one from an Anglo country, developed country, had the guts to tell me to my face, not only is there nothing here, the only thing that's here are human beings. And by the by, there's too many of them. In many ways, it's overpopulated. And that did not carry the day. Didn't even make the radar. Self-interest makes the radar. Self-interest. And so, until we realize that our self-interest is humanity-wise, humanity-wide, and that every conflict out there is going to affect us one way or another. Every one of those conflicts have got millions of people in refugee camps, in internally displaced camps, because there are massive movements of population in these civil wars and so on. Well, what do you think is in there? Pandemics. Pandemics that spread. Stuff that we haven't even imagined yet, and they have hit on a couple of occasions. They're the sources of rage because of loss of hope. And that rage turns into extremism, and that extremism turns into terrorism. And where do you think the targets are? That some of those countries are crucial to our well-being. That there are some of those countries with resources that we need that we're being ripped off and we're not being able to get a decent ethical resource. And lastly, I would argue that many of the diasporas that are in our countries, that are still immigrating people, are still caught up with what's going on back home. They haven't been able to completely divorce themselves from it. And that creates frictions at the community level. I'm working right now with the police forces in Canada with my child soldier work on the anti-radicalization of extreme violence, the recruitment thereof, youths. We're working through diaspora communities to get at diaspora gangs, to turn the gangs, to find the lone wolves that might be turned to extremism. That's what we're doing. That's what we got to do. Those conflicts are here. We can recruit even here, let alone be the target. Of course, for us Canadians, we don't have to worry about it because nobody knows we're there. And if you don't believe me, tonight when you go back, you look at on any channel, any of the weatherman's maps, and tell me what's north of the United States. They don't even have the decency to write Canada. And they just give us a hard time every time there's an Arctic blast coming from Canada. That's right, as if we invented the damn thing. And that's my short answer. Thank you for that question. Okay. Oh, come on. Anybody else?
Can I ask you on the stovepipe thing? Because you've been in both camps. You've worked with humanitarian groups, international NGOs, but also with military, police, UN forces. Where do you see the most openness to these ideas of collaboration and sort of building a new way of getting in front of these systemic problems? Is it in the humanitarian section of the people, or is it actually in the military?
In fact, that's very interesting because at the strategic level, there is a significant reticence of making them work together because they're protecting their turf in that absolutely stupid way of thinking that they got to keep their empire there, and if they move into other areas, they'll lose their influence. So, be they NGOs, be they Médecins Sans Frontières, be they Human Rights Watch, or be they World Food Program, be they the UN, be they the militaries, the turf at the strategic level has not been broken. At the lower level, the new members, the ones in the field, the ones getting their boots dirty, but in the coalface, there we see extraordinary advances. Why? Because they're the ones facing the ethical and moral and legal dilemmas. They're facing the people, they're facing the kids, they're smelling it, they're touching it, they're feeling it, they're being shot at, they're being abused. And they, by necessity, are working out things together. But it's very personality driven still. It's not formal. It depends on who the players are and to what extent they want to play and their personal ambitions. The ones that are really preventing the significant change is the middle gang, the middle managers, the ones at the force level, mission level, the ones that are below the big headquarters level, who should be taking the lessons of those in the field and bringing forward those lessons to the higher and fighting that strategic level. You're not seeing that. and they're the culprits. Because so many are driven by their own personal ambitions, by their commitment to that specific task, and are wrapped up at the operational level and tactical level and not thinking the strategic level. And the strategic bodies are not bringing them together to talk more and to be able to work out. I would argue that the middle gang is the one that is preventing us from literally becoming multidisciplinary, for creating the need, creating that will. And so the innovative thinking is not necessarily from the young ones who are bringing up ideas. It's from that middle gang who can mature them enough to be able to put them into policies that the big guys can play with.
Not a question, but I just wanted to say, as someone who lived in Nigeria as a child and was a teenager in Canada at the time of both the Somalian crisis and the Rwanda genocide, thank you. You're someone who I've admired and looked up to immensely since I was in high school. Thank you for everything that you've done, both from the military perspective and all the NGO work that you've done. Thank you for sharing your story and your humanity with us when you came back to Canada. And I remember how rough that was for you as an individual before you started your work with the Senate. So just a very big thank you to you. Merci pour venir ici, pour être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. Merci pour votre service et merci pour partager votre humanité avec nous.
I could have picked him out as the Canadian. Why? He's the only guy with a tie.
Oh man. and there was no meat at lunch.
That's right. That's right.
And there was only
But
water.
the second point is what the hell are you doing down here? You know that wall is coming up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ladies and
Yes,
gentlemen.
that's